in Toronto, raised by hardworking immigrant parents, Cynthia Appiah is breaking down barriers in the world of bobsleigh. Aiming to become one of Canada's first black bobsleigh pilots, Cynthia's years of hard work have led her to the brink of achieving that dream at the 2022 Olympics in Beijing. But it hasn't always been a smooth ride for her. After failing to make the 2018 national team as a full-time brakewoman, Cynthia was forced into an alternate role, watching from the sidelines as her Olympic dream never fully materialized. Frustrated with that decision and contemplating her future, Cynthia decided to pursue becoming a pilot, taking control of her career and smashing any racist stereotypes that once stood regarding black athletes in the bobsleigh world. Appiah is shooting to represent Canada in both the two-woman bobsleigh and the women's monobob, which puts a single athlete in the role of pilot and brakewoman. A physical force with a work ethic to match, Cynthia Appiah is on track to make headlines come 2022 and beyond.
So I want to talk about you and your story and your family. I have heard you speak so lovingly about your parents. So maybe just start from the beginning, the support and the love you feel for your family.
Yeah, they are my rock. They've been supportive from day one. Obviously, a little apprehensive because bobsleigh is not the safest sport, and they've definitely watched a lot of races and were a little bit unnerved when I was so passionate about switching from track and field to bobsleigh. But at no point in time did they, try to dissuade me from doing it when I, kind of set my mind to it. And over the years, with all the success and all the, disappointments that I've had throughout my career, they've been my number one supporters, especially my sisters. I talk to them on a near daily basis, and they are my biggest fans.
So you're the child of immigrants in Toronto growing up. I read that it was actually like a Jays initiative that wet your whistle or piqued your interest when it came to sport. Is that true?
It is. So I grew up in Toronto community housing, and in the summer they had this partnership with the Toronto Blue Jays called Rookie League, I believe it was called. And every Thursday in the summer, we'd all head down to Riverdale Park and just play baseball. And that was kind of like my first introduction into competitive sport. Prior to that, it was just playing games at recess. I think at one point in my first elementary school, we had like a mini league that we had in hockey, but it wasn't really competitive. It was more like, hey, let's all have fun. But with Rookie League, we were competing against other kids from other Toronto community housing complexes. And that I was terrible at it. Let me just tell you right now, I have no hand-eye coordination. But I loved baseball enough that it kind of really piqued my interest to try out other sports. And so when I moved to my second elementary school, I tried any sport I could, no matter how good or bad I was at it. So soccer, volleyball, and then ultimately I settled with track and field because it was just the funnest for me. Like I was sprinting against my friends, I was throwing against my friends, and I really liked that competitive aspect of I'm competing directly with everyone else to see how well I can do against them.
And so York University became your path. So what did you specialize in there?
So I went to York and specialized in the hammer and shot put outdoors, and then the weight throw and shot put indoors. So hammer and weight throw are similar concepts. There's a ball, a chain, and a handle, and you swing it a bunch of times and throw it out. And then shot put's just, shot put. And I did relatively well. I mean, when I was leaving high school going into university, I had no intention of even going into track and field. And it just happened by chance that the York University throwing coach happened to be at the OFSA championships, the Ontario High School Championships in Hamilton that year. And I had already applied to York. I think we exchanged emails, and, we kept in correspondence throughout the summer. And so when I went to York in the fall, that kind of just opened up that door of being a truly competitive athlete, a student athlete. And, the 5 years that I spent at York were, some really good memories I had there. And then that in and of itself opened up the door towards bobsleigh, which is where I'm at now.
Okay, so explain how that happens. I mean, I've been around the bobsleigh world a tiny bit, so I realized that nobody starts in bobsleigh, right? So you
Hmm.
end up learning about it later in life. It's mostly athletes like you who get recruited. So how did it happen for you?
Yeah, so for me, it honestly, I don't know if you want to call it fate or serendipity, or it just literally it happened. It fell into my lap. So I got an email from our strength and conditioning coach at the time saying that Ontario Bobsleigh was coming to York University to host some dryland test camps. So usually these test camps have you run a 30-meter sprint, you do some jumps and some weightlifting component, and it was going to be at the track and field center at York. And I thought, well, I'm already here. I had just watched the Vancouver games, either that winter or the winter prior, and I was like, hey, let's just try it out. And I did okay at those test camps, and that kind of piqued my interest of like, okay, once I'm done university at York, this might be an avenue worth checking out.
Does everybody start as a break person? Is that where, like, are always starting by pushing? Is that how, like, the
Some
natural
people
evolution?
do. Yeah, some people do. You start off. Some people do start off as brakemen. My first foray into bobsleigh was actually a driving school
Hmm.
in Lake Placid, New York, and it just happened to be that when I was called onto the Ontario team, they needed brake women, and so I kind of switched paths at that point. And I wasn't really, stuck on being a driver at that point. So, going in as a brakeman was totally fine for me. And yeah, the easiest path into the sport and into making it onto the national team is through the brakeman role. And so that's where I spent the better part of like 3 or 4 years before switching to driving, was as a brakewoman on the Ontario team and then on the national development team and then ultimately the national team.
I have to assume, I mean, everything in your sport is leading up to that moment. And
Hmm.
did you fully expect to be participating? What happened in Pyeongchang?
Going into the final race of the qualifying period, I had, a pretty good idea that I was going to be on that Olympic roster, but I kind of also had that, I tend to be a little bit of a cynic. I had a feeling going into the last race that I wasn't going to be on the Olympic roster. And after that race, I got pulled aside by one of the coaches, and he basically told me what I kind of knew. And that was that I wasn't going to be on the Olympic team as a racing brakeman. I was going to be there as an alternate. And so, in the event that someone gets injured, that's when I would be allowed to race. And I just felt like my world was like crumbling down because I was like, I don't understand. I hit every protocol you asked. I did everything you asked for. On paper, it should have made sense that I would have been on the Olympic team, but sometimes decisions are made that are completely out of your control, and that was, I think, the hardest part to come to terms with because based off of what had been presented to us, I fully believed I had, checked every box and should have been on that Olympic team.
I mean, that sounds really hard, like really, really hard. Um, in in retrospect, I have to imagine it's a little bit easier, but I can still feel the pain of it for you. I guess what lessons did you learn from that? I mean, you have to learn some really tough life lessons within that situation.
So I went down to Lake Placid. I think it was in April at that point, and had a blast. Met some really cool people that I consider really good friends from different parts of the world now. And I came home from those 3 weeks and had to really sit down and think about whether this was something I wanted to do, whether it was worth going back for another 4 years to a team that I no longer trusted and a system that I thought was fractured. I won't say, well, yeah, fractured. Um, and to now commit financially again to a sport where you don't really make any money, especially as a pilot. Um, and so again, it took a couple of weeks to really think things through. And ultimately, I decided to come back and knew that if that coming back meant coming back as a pilot and not as a brakeman, because I did not want someone else controlling my career anymore.
Hmm.
As a pilot, you do have a little bit more say in how you dictate your career. And I felt like if I was going to go back, I was going all in, no matter what. And it had to be in the pilot role.
I mean, One thing we haven't even touched on at all, and you've been very vocal about this, is bobsleigh and these sliding sports are predominantly white. So, you're also dealing with that variable
Yeah.
in, and that landscape, as it were. And you've said that in particular, there's this weird preconceived notion that Black people can't be good pilots.
Yeah.
First of all, like, where does that even come from and how does it manifest?
I don't even know. I honestly I've tried thinking it through numerous times, and I think I just end up hurting my brain trying to figure out how you even come to that conclusion. Because Black people have been in the sport of bobsleigh for a long time, predominantly in the brakeman role. And I don't know if it's kind of like an unspoken rule or an unspoken, mindset that that's the extent that a Black person or a person of color can do within a winter sport, particularly bobsleigh. And we only supply, or Black people only come in and fulfill the role of brakeman, and that is the extent of it. And in the last, I would say, 8 to 10 years now, you're seeing more and more Black people coming in and coming in as pilots or transitioning from brake person into the pilot role, because you essentially lengthen your career as a pilot. You can stay around for a bit longer. But for me, it's more fun being a pilot. Like, I don't think anybody, if I went down into the street and I was like, hey, how would you like just sticking your head between your legs and then going down for runs after run after run after run? Eventually it gets boring. Whereas being a pilot, you get to see where you're going, which is such a huge plus. But it's a new challenge to try and overcome. Like, and I don't want to knock down being a brake person, because obviously I was a brake person for 3 years on the national team. But the role kind of becomes monotonous, where it's like you're just pushing and then you're sitting in and then you're waiting to the end to break, and in the meantime you're hoping your pilot doesn't crash you.
Do you feel like, have you encountered micro or macro aggressions on this particular path?
I have, but not in, you know not as it pertains to me being a pilot. I mean, you hear microaggressions, unfortunately, all the time inside
Yeah.
and outside of sport. Unfortunately, as a Black athlete, that seems to be something that sadly comes with the territory. I fortunately have not been confronted with any microaggressions personally. However,
Mhm.
I've heard of stories across the sport. I mean, a few years back, we had a coach who blatantly said, Black people are not good drivers. This past summer, we had a sled manufacturer who said that he didn't want quote unquote monkeys driving in his sled, and if he wanted to see that, he'd go to the zoo.
For
So these
me,
people, yeah, it was such a crazy thing to hear, and I was like, I don't know. Part of me feels like sometimes I live in a bubble where I'm interacting with all these people, and you just think, oh yeah, they're cool. They would never say that. But then you hear someone like a coach or a sled manufacturer saying these things, and it's kind of leads you to think that they're in an environment that almost encourages that kind of comment to be made, because clearly no one has ever come to them and said that's not cool.
I my mind is literally, I can't even, that's just so awful.
Yeah.
Uh, well, let's talk about your now career as a pilot. So basically, you went and you decided it was for you. You didn't drop out of the sport, thank goodness. So how has it been for you? I mean, I know I've seen your results both in two man or two person, and in the monobob. You've done really well.
Thank you. It's been an interesting 3 years. I've been driving for three, and there's been a lot of ups and downs. This particular season was probably the most challenging. Like, even with COVID, it was sorry, even without COVID, it was a challenging year. We spent the first half of the season in Whistler, which is the only track we have available to us now. Unfortunately, the Calgary closed for the foreseeable future. And it was, rocky from the start. Like, I just couldn't seem to conceptualize why I was struggling on my own home track. And it's a track that I know very well. And I was, you know, I think mentally I was drained. and I wasn't driving well at all. So I fully expected to be cut from the team. I thought that this is where my journey ended, and I had made the wrong decision to switch to piloting. And yet the coaches were still like, no, we still believe in you. We still think you have what it takes. So I was selected to come over to Europe. And I think that's where I flourished. I mean, the second half of the season was night and day compared to what I had in the first half.
Well, I'm super excited to watch this happen, and I fully expect to see you there. I want to talk about a couple of your extracurriculars. First of all, there's a great article that just came out and talked about your nickname, Synthepedia,
Oh, yes.
and that you're a trivia junkie, and it's actually like your life's dream to end up on Jeopardy. Um,
Yes.
so, I mean, how did you become a trivia junkie, and why Jeopardy?
Um, I don't even know how I became a trivia junkie. I think it's just one of those things where I just started spouting random info for no apparent reason. And it could go back to like the fact that my parents really instilled education into us. Above everything, they were like, make sure you go to school. You know, they were working class people. Like they both worked low paying jobs. They're unskilled workers or unskilled laborers, and they didn't want their kids to have the life that they had. So they really instilled education, and I feel like that kind of, you know, is something that I live today. I mean, I went to school. My sisters and brother all went to school, and we made sure that education was at the forefront of anything that we did. I don't even know when we started watching Jeopardy, and we watched it as a family. Like
Right.
I remember, 7:30 on the dot. We had Jeopardy on, and it was like a battle.
I wanted to talk to you also before we go about a way that you're giving back to the community, and that's through an organization called Classroom Champions. So,
Hmm.
what is that? I know, but I wanted people to know what it is. And what do you do? What's your participation?
Yeah, so Classroom Champions is an organization that was started by a former bobsledder, Steve Messler, and he found whenever he went into school to talk to the students, it was like a one-off, and there was no way to gauge how well the students received whatever message he brought in. And so he started Classroom Champions as a way to continue that connection that athletes or guest speakers bring to students across North America. And so I'm a part of this such a great organization. I've partnered with two schools, one in BC, one in Alberta, and we just kind of create a separate curriculum based off of different topics like, how to keep your emotions in check, how to be resilient, goal setting. And so we have different topics that we talk about that we, record beforehand and then send it out to the teachers who then incorporate it into their curriculum.
And Cynthia, this is the question we leave all of our guests with. Imagine you're talking to a Classroom Champions group, and a young Cynthia is sitting there. What is your advice to her?
Oh, wow. Jeez. I would say be confident in what you do. I know one of the things that I've had to really work towards is knowing that my voice is strong and that you know, I belong where I belong and I deserve to be in the places that I want to be in. And having that confidence and that resolve and knowing that if you work for what you want and you hold your head up high and you're confident in what you want, you will achieve those dreams.
I love that. Okay, so Olympics 2022, Jeopardy 2023. I'm counting on it.
Yes.
Cynthia, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.